The cold woke Clementine first. It was a thief in the dark, stealing the last of the warmth from her bones. She was curled on her side, a thin blanket clutched to her chin, and the ground beneath her was hard as iron. The fire was dead. Not just embers, but stone-cold ash that puffed away in the thin, sharp wind of the high country. Her eyes opened to a sky full of stars, cruelly bright and distant. The moon was gone. She sat up, the blanket falling away. The world was shades of deep blue and black. The pines stood like silent sentinels, their scent clean and unforgiving. She was alone. The wagon was gone. The 2 mules, gone. Mr. and Mrs. Barlow, the couple who had hired her in St. Joseph to help with their children on the trail west, were gone. They had taken her small trunk, which held her mother's locket and the $17 she had saved over a lifetime of service. They had taken the last of the salted pork and the sack of flour. They had taken everything. And they had left her. She scrambled to her feet, a cry catching in her throat. "Mr. Barlow?" Her voice was a dry whisper, swallowed by the immense silence. She tried again, louder. "Mrs. Barlow?" Only the wind answered, sighing through the needles of the tall pines. She could see the tracks in the dirt, ruts from the wagon wheels heading west, already beginning to soften at the edges. They had left while she slept, moving with a thief's quiet. They had promised her a new life in Oregon, a position as a governess. They had been kind, smiling people, and they had left her for dead in the middle of nowhere. Panic was a cold fist closing around her heart. She had a small knife in her pocket, the thin blanket, and the clothes on her back. A sturdy wool skirt and a worn blouse. She had no food, no water beyond the nearly empty canteen at her hip, and no idea how far it was to the next town. Days, the Barlows had said. Days of hard travel. She took a sip of water, just enough to wet her throat, and looked at the map Barlow had shown her only yesterday. He had pointed a thick finger at a vast empty space on the paper. "Nothing out here," he had boomed, his voice full of false confidence. "Not a soul for 80 miles. We push through this stretch fast." 80 miles. The thought was a death sentence. She sank back to the ground, the fight draining out of her. The cold was relentless. It was late autumn, and the nights were already dipping below freezing. She could last a day, maybe 2. The wolves would find her before any traveler did. She pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders, her body trembling not just from cold, but from a despair so profound it felt like drowning. She had been cast out by her family after her father's death, left with nothing. The Barlows had seemed like salvation. Now they were just the final betrayal in a life full of them. She closed her eyes, thinking of her mother's face, a faint memory like pressed flowers. She prayed a silent, broken prayer, not for rescue, but for a quick end. As she sat there, shivering in the pre-dawn dark, a new scent cut through the clean, cold pine. It was faint at first, almost imaginary. Woodsmoke. Her head snapped up. She sniffed the air, turning her face into the breeze. It was there, unmistakable. The smell of a pine fire, burning somewhere in the vast emptiness. It was impossible. Barlow's map, the certainty in his voice. Nothing out here. She stood up, her heart starting a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. The scent was a thread, thin and fragile, but it was real. It came from the north, deeper into the mountains, away from the trail. To follow it was to walk away from any slim chance of a passing wagon. It was to trust a ghost, a scent on the wind, over the solid fact of the trail. But the trail had brought her here, to this cold and lonely death. The trail was a lie. What was one more? With the first pale light of dawn striping the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose, Clementine made her choice. She folded the thin blanket, tied it around her waist, and turned her back on the wagon tracks. She faced the mountains, lifted her chin, and followed the smell of smoke. The first hours were a testament to grit. The terrain rose steeply, the game trails she followed vanishing and reappearing. The sun climbed, but it offered little warmth at this altitude. The air remained thin and cold. The smoke was her only compass. Sometimes the wind would shift, and the scent would vanish, leaving her in a world of silent rock and whispering pine. In those moments, terror would claw at her again. She would stop, stand perfectly still, and wait, her whole being focused on that one sense. Then, a slight shift in the breeze, and it would return, faint but true, pulling her onward. She chewed on pine needles to trick the hunger in her belly. She refilled her canteen at a stream so cold it made her teeth ache, the water tasting of stone and ice. Her worn boots, not meant for such terrain, began to rub her heels raw. Every step was a small act of faith. The map called this land empty. Her own eyes saw nothing but wilderness, but her nose told her a different story. Someone was alive out here. Someone had a fire. By midday, the scent was stronger, thicker. It was no longer a ghost, but a presence. It smelled of pine, yes, but also of burning cedar, a richer, warmer smell. It clung to the trees, a signpost for a desperate traveler. She was climbing a long, wooded ridge, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning with exhaustion. Below her, a valley opened up, a basin of darker green cupped between the gray peaks, and in the center of it, rising straight and true into the blue, cloudless sky, was the thin plume of white smoke. It came from a chimney, a stone chimney, attached to a small dark shape half hidden in a stand of old-growth aspen. A cabin. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. It was real. A roof, walls, a fire, a human being. She half ran, half stumbled down the slope, her tired feet catching on roots and loose stones. As she drew closer, the place began to resolve itself. The cabin was old, built of heavy, hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silver gray. The roof was long furred with moss. It looked exactly like a place that had been abandoned for 50 years, a forgotten relic of some long-dead prospector. But the chimney was puffing smoke, and as she broke through the last line of trees into the small clearing, she saw other signs. A stack of firewood, neatly split and piled high against the cabin wall. The wood on top was fresh, the pale, raw ends of the pine logs smelling resinous and sharp against the old, decayed scent of the forest floor. The contrast was jarring. Decay on the place, freshness on the life. A narrow path, swept clean of pine needles and leaves, led to the single door. There was a small, empty corral to one side, its rails gray and leaning, but one section had been replaced with new, unweathered wood. Someone was here. Someone was living in the cabin the maps called empty. Clementine reached the door, her hand outstretched. It was made of thick, solid planks, and as her fingers brushed against it, she felt a faint warmth radiating through the wood. The fire was just on the other side. Hope and fear warred within her. Who lived in such a place, so far from the world? A madman? A hermit? Someone who did not want to be found? She was too tired to care. She raised a fist, heavy as lead, and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the quiet air. She waited, her ear pressed to the wood. She could hear the crackle of the fire inside, nothing more. She knocked again. Harder this time. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." Silence. The smoke continued to curl from the chimney. The fire was burning. Someone had to be inside. Had they heard her and chosen not to answer? The fear returned, colder this time. Maybe this was a trap. Maybe the smoke was a lure. But the cold was seeping back into her, and the edges of her vision were starting to blur with exhaustion. She had nothing left. She leaned her forehead against the warm door, the solid feel of it the only comfort in the world. And then, her legs gave out. The world tilted, a swirl of gray wood and green trees and blue sky, and she slid down the door into a heap on the ground, the darkness taking her completely. When she woke, she was not on the cold ground. She was on a narrow cot, covered by a thick, heavy wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and lye soap. The air was warm. A fire was burning in a stone fireplace across the small room, its light dancing on the log walls. The room was sparse, clean, and masculine. A single table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tinned goods, another shelf with a few worn books. Through a doorway, she could see a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. She was safe. She was warm. She was not alone. A man was standing by the fire, his back to her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin trousers and a dark wool shirt. He was staring into the flames, his posture rigid. He had not heard her stir. Clementine pushed herself up on her elbows, the blanket pooling around her waist. The movement made a soft rustling sound. He turned, not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate motion. His face was all harsh angles and shadow in the firelight, framed by dark, shaggy hair and a short, untrimmed beard. He had the kind of face that was handsome, but had been made hard by life. It was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly pale gray, and they were filled with a deep, unwavering suspicion. He looked at her not as a person to be helped, but as a problem to be solved. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, unused. "My name is Clementine," she said, her own voice little more than a whisper. "Clementine Hayes." He said nothing, just watched her, his expression unreadable. "I was traveling west," she continued, her throat dry. "With a family. The Barlows. They left me. In the night. Took everything." His eyes narrowed slightly. "The Barlows." He said the name as if it tasted foul. "And you found your way here." It was not a question. "I saw the smoke," she said. "The map they had. It said this place was empty." "The map is right," he said flatly. "This place is empty." The words hung in the air between them, a clear and brutal dismissal. He was the man who lived in the empty place. He did not want her here. He had brought her in, given her warmth, but that was the extent of his charity. I'm sorry to intrude," she stammered, trying to swing her legs off the cot. A wave of dizziness washed over her and she swayed. "I'll leave, just as soon as I can." He took a step forward, not to help her, but as if to bar her way. "You'll go nowhere tonight. There's a storm coming. You'd die before you made it a mile." He was right. Through the single, small window she could see the sky had turned a leaden gray. The wind was howling now, a mournful sound around the eaves of the cabin. He had saved her life, whether he wanted to or not. He turned away from her and ladled something from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her. It was a thin broth, but it smelled rich and savory. He did not hand it to her. He set it on the small crate that served as a bedside table. "Eat," he commanded. Then he retreated to his position by the fire, his back to her once more. A wall of silence and disapproval. Clementine ate. The broth was hot and life-giving. It was made with wild mushrooms and some kind of game, and it sent warmth spreading through her limbs. She ate slowly, watching his back. He was like a fortress, closed and guarded. Every line of him screamed that he wanted to be left alone. And yet, he had carried her inside. He had covered her with his own blanket. He had fed her. When she finished, she set the bowl down. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a short, sharp nod but did not turn. "Rest. You can have the cot. I'll take the floor." "I can't take your bed." she protested. "It's not a request," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He took a second blanket from a wooden chest, spread it on the floorboards before the hearth, and lay down, facing the fire, his body a clear boundary between them. Clementine lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The storm broke then, the wind shrieking and throwing handfuls of sleet against the window pane. The cabin was a small, warm haven in the heart of the gale. She was safe, but she had traded one kind of wilderness for another. She was stranded with a man who looked at her as if she were a ghost, a man who lived in a place the world had forgotten, a man who had saved her life, and clearly already regretted it. His name, she realized, she didn't even know. She fell asleep to the sound of the storm, the crackle of the fire, and the steady, quiet breathing of the stranger on the floor. She woke to silence. The storm had passed. The fire was a bed of glowing embers, and pale morning light filtered through the window. The man was gone. His blanket was neatly folded at the foot of her cot. For a panicked moment she thought he had left her just as the Barlows had, vanished into the woods. But the cabin door was closed, and on the table sat a bowl of oatmeal and a tin cup of what smelled like chicory coffee. He was testing her, she realized, or simply avoiding her. He was providing for her, but keeping his distance. She ate the oatmeal, which was warm and sweetened with a dollop of molasses. It was the most satisfying meal she had ever had. Her strength was returning, the deep ache in her bones receding. Her heels were blistered and raw, but she could walk. She had to. She could not stay here. She found her boots by the hearth, dried and oiled. The leather was supple. He had tended to them while she slept. The small, unspoken kindness was more disorienting than his gruffness. Who was this man, who communicated in chores and silence? She pulled on her boots, wincing as they pressed against her blisters, and stood. The cabin felt different in the daylight. It was meticulously clean. The floor was swept, the few possessions arranged with a Spartan order. It was the home of a man who had pared his life down to the essentials. On the shelf with the books, she saw a title, Moby Dick. The spine was broken, the pages soft with use. Next to it was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a wren, its head cocked as if listening. It was the only object in the room that served no practical purpose. It felt like a secret. She had to thank him, and she had to tell him she was leaving. She opened the cabin door and stepped out into the cold, clean air. The world was blanketed in a thin layer of white. The storm had brought the first snow of the season. It clung to the pine boughs and dusted the ground, silencing everything. He was at the corral, repairing the leaning fence rail she had noticed yesterday. He worked with an efficient, powerful grace, setting a new post with a heavy mallet. He wore a thick sheepskin coat, and his breath plumed in the air. He did not look up as she approached, though he must have heard the crunch of her boots in the snow. "Good morning," she said, her voice small in the vast quiet. He finished driving the post, tested it with his weight, and only then did he turn to face her. His gray eyes were just as guarded in the daylight. "Morning. Thank you, for the breakfast, for everything." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over her. "You look better." "I am. I'm strong enough to travel. If you could just point me toward the nearest town, I'll be on my way. I won't trouble you any longer." He looked away from her, his eyes scanning the snow-covered peaks that ringed the valley. "Nearest town is Harmony. It's a 2-day walk from here, and that's if you know the way. With this snow, the passes will be treacherous. You'd be lucky to make it." "I have to try," she insisted. "I can't impose on you." "You think I brought you in here for my own amusement?" he said, his voice sharp with irritation. "I did it so I wouldn't have to bury a body. Leaving now is the same as leaving 2 nights ago. You'll die." The bluntness of it stunned her into silence. "You'll stay?" he stated, his tone final. until the snow melts and the way is clear. You can help. Earn your keep. He jerked his chin toward the cabin. There's wood to be split, water to be hauled. I'm not running a charity. It was a strange sort of hospitality, offered like a sentence. But it was also a lifeline. He was offering her shelter, a chance to survive. She had no other choice. All right, she said quietly. I can work. He seemed surprised by her quick agreement, by the lack of argument. A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossed his face before the mask of indifference slammed back down. The axe is by the woodpile. Don't cut your foot off. He turned back to his fence, the conversation over. Clementine went to the woodpile. The axe was heavy, but the handle was smooth and worn. She had split wood before, on the small farm where she grew up. She set a log on the block, took her stance, and swung. The axe bit deep and true, splitting the log in two clean halves. She set up another. She worked all morning, her body protesting but her mind finding a strange peace in the rhythm of the task. Chop, split, stack. She could feel his eyes on her from the corral, though he never stopped his own work. He was watching her, judging her competence. She did not let it unnerve her. She just worked, letting the simple, honest labor fill the spaces where fear had been. When the sun was high, he came back to the cabin. He carried a bucket of water from the creek she had seen nearby. He didn't speak to her, just went inside. A few minutes later, he came back to the door. Lunch, he said, and disappeared back inside. She followed him in. He had put a pot of stew on the table, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of venison. He had also laid out 2 bowls and 2 spoons. It was the first time he had acknowledged her as something other than a temporary problem. They ate in silence. The only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood and the crackle of the fire. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was just quiet. "What's your name?" she asked, breaking it. He looked up, startled, as if he had forgotten she could speak. He hesitated for a long moment. "Cade," he said at last. "Cade," she repeated. It was a strong, simple name, like him. "Thank you for the meal, Cade." He just nodded and went back to his stew. But she had seen it again, that flicker in his eyes. He was a man so used to being alone that a simple question was like a stone tossed into a still pond. The days fell into a routine. They worked. They ate. They existed in the same small space, orbiting each other like wary planets. Clementine took over the cooking, stretching the supplies with a skill born of a lean childhood. She made bread from his dwindling flour supply, a thick, hearty sourdough that filled the cabin with a warm, yeasty smell. She mended his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She did not do it to please him, but for herself. Work was how she made her place in the world. Cade, in turn, seemed to accept her presence. He never spoke of his past or of why he lived here, alone. But he began to leave small offerings, a handful of late-season berries on the table, a strangely shaped stone from the creek bed that looked like a heart. He never mentioned them. They just appeared. One afternoon, she was sweeping the floor when her broom knocked the small carved wren from the bookshelf. It fell to the floorboards with a soft clatter. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of the wings, the tiny, perfect head. It was made with such care, such love. Cade was standing in the doorway, having come in from checking his snares. He froze when he saw the bird in her hand. His face went pale, the hard mask crumbling to reveal a raw, aching grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered, holding it out to him. "I knocked it over." He didn't take it. He just stared at it in her palm as if it were a living thing. "My brother made that," he said, his voice thick. "Liam. He could make wood sing." It was the most he had ever said about himself. It was a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pain so deep it stole her breath. "He's dead." He said the word like a curse. He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her standing there with the small wooden bird in her hand, the weight of his loss suddenly filling the small room. He did not come back for hours. Clementine put the bird carefully back on its shelf and spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of quiet anxiety. She had trespassed, stumbled into a place of private sorrow. When he finally returned at dusk, his face was once again a mask of stone, but she knew now what it was hiding. It was not anger. It was grief. That night the silence felt different. It was heavier, freighted with the unspoken story of his brother. Clementine found she could not sleep. She lay on her cot, listening to the fire and the sound of Cade's breathing from his place on the floor. He was restless, turning and muttering in a troubled sleep. She slipped out of bed and went to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames leaped up, casting a warm glow over his sleeping face. In sleep, the harsh lines were softened. He looked younger, more vulnerable. He looked like a man who had been terribly hurt. She sat in the chair by the fire, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, and decided to watch over him. It was a small thing, but it felt right. She would keep the fire going. She would keep the darkness at bay for him, just for one night. As she sat there, a thought surfaced. A line from a book she had read long ago. He saves her, and she saves him. She had no idea how she could possibly save a man as strong and self-sufficient as Cade, but as she watched him sleep, a fierce, protective feeling rose in her. She wanted to. He woke just before dawn. His eyes opened and found her in the chair. He didn't look surprised, just weary. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice raspy with sleep. "I know," she said. "Go back to sleep. I have the watch." A long moment passed. He looked from her face to the warm, steady fire. For the first time since she had arrived, the suspicion in his eyes was gone. In its place was something else, something fragile and hesitant. Gratitude. "Clementine," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. He didn't say anything else. He just closed his eyes and, a few moments later, his breathing evened out into a deep and peaceful sleep. Clementine stayed in the chair, guarding his rest until the sun came up. Something had shifted between them in the night. The wall had not come down, but a small gate had been opened. The thaw came slowly, in drips and patches. The snow receded, leaving the ground damp and fragrant with the smell of wet earth. Clementine knew she should be planning her departure. The way to Harmony would be clear soon. But the thought of leaving the quiet valley, of leaving Cade, filled her with a strange dread. This place, which should have been a prison, had begun to feel like a sanctuary. One morning, Cade announced he was going to check a line of traps he had set higher up the mountain. "It's a full day's walk. I'll be back by dark." "I could come," she offered. "I can carry a share." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But keep up." They walked in their usual silence, but it was a comfortable one now. Clementine was stronger, her body hardened by the work. She easily kept pace with his long strides. He pointed out tracks in the mud, deer, rabbit, a lone wolf. He showed her which plants were edible, which were medicine. He was teaching her his world piece by piece. As they climbed, the valley spread out below them. "This was all Callaway land once," he said, his voice quiet. "My family's. From that ridge to the river." "Callaway?" she asked. "Is that your name?" "Cade Callaway," he confirmed. "My father and his father before him ran cattle here. We were proud of it." "What happened?" she asked gently. His face hardened. A man happened. A partner my father took on. His name was Reed. After my parents died, Reed stayed on to help me and Liam. We trusted him. He said the ranch was failing, that we were deep in debt. He convinced us to sign papers, to sell off the herds, to mortgage the land to him to cover these supposed debts. We were young. We didn't know any better. He stopped walking, his hands clenched into fists. It was all lies. There were no debts. He fabricated the ledgers. He stole it all, piece by piece, with a pen and a smile. Liam figured it out. He found the real books Reed had hidden. He was going to ride to the county seat to expose him. Cade's voice dropped to a raw whisper. He never made it. His horse came back lame, alone. They found him at the bottom of a ravine, called it an accident. I know it wasn't. Reed killed him, but I couldn't prove it. Reed had the law in his pocket, the deed in his hand. He told me to get out or I'd end up like my brother. So I came here, to the old line shack my grandfather built. I let the world think I was gone. A man can get used to being a ghost if he tries hard enough. The story settled over Clementine, heavy and cold. The quiet grief she had sensed in him was now a living, breathing monster. He had not just lost his brother. He had lost his home, his name, his entire world to a thief and a murderer. I'm so sorry, Cade, she said, her heart aching for him. He shrugged, the mask of indifference returning, but his eyes were bleak. It was a long time ago. They reached the traps, and the conversation ended. But the story stayed with her, planting itself in her mind. Reed. The name was a poison seed. On the way back down the mountain, as dusk was settling, they saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, far down the valley, in the direction of the trail. It was a campfire. Cade stopped dead, pulling her behind a granite outcropping. Get down, he hissed. Who is it? She whispered. I don't know. No one comes this way. He peered through a crack in the rock, his body tense as a coiled spring. 2 men. A wagon. Clementine's blood ran cold. The Barlows, she breathed. Cade looked at her sharply. You're sure? They had a green wagon, with one wheel painted yellow. I can see it. Cade cursed under his breath. What would they be doing back here? They must have gone to Harmony, heard you never arrived, and came back looking. Looking for what? She asked. To make sure I was dead? Maybe, he said, his eyes dark. Or maybe they heard something in town. Maybe they heard the Calloway ghost still walks these hills, and they think there's treasure buried here. People like that are always sniffing after easy money. They watched as the 2 men set up camp. It was Jonas Barlow, and a younger, meaner-looking man she didn't recognize. They were less than a mile from the cabin. They would find it in the morning. They can't find you, Cade said, his voice grim. They'll see you're alive, and they'll see me. They'll go straight back to Reed. He can't afford to have a Calloway turn up. Not one who knows the truth. His old wound, his deep-seated fear of Reed, was taking over. He was thinking of retreating, of hiding. We have to leave, he said, grabbing her arm. Tonight, we can go higher into the mountains. And live like ghosts forever? She challenged him, pulling her arm free. No, Cade, you've been hiding long enough. This is your home. We're not running. You don't understand, he said, his voice ragged with a decade of fear. Reed is powerful. He will crush us. He's a liar and a killer. She shot back, her own fear turning to anger. The truth is, the one thing he can't crush. Your brother found it. It's here somewhere. The real ledgers. You said he hid them. I looked for years. Cade exploded, his voice echoing in the twilight. I tore this cabin apart. I searched every inch of this valley. They're gone. Reed probably found them and burned them long ago. Maybe you were looking in the wrong place, she said, her mind racing. Liam was clever. He could make wood sing. he wouldn't have just buried them in the dirt. She thought of the cabin. Every detail of it she had come to know. The clean lines, the simple furniture, and the one object that didn't belong. The one piece of poetry in a room of prose. The bird, she whispered. The wren. Cade stared at her. What are you talking about? The carving. Liam made it. It's the only thing in that cabin you didn't make yourself, isn't it? It's hollow, Cade. I promise you it's hollow. He looked at her as if she were mad. But then, a flicker of desperate hope lit his eyes. He turned and started down the mountain, not running from the fire, but toward the cabin. Clementine followed close behind. They burst into the cabin, the last of the light failing outside. Cade went straight to the shelf and snatched the small wooden bird. He held it in his hands, turning it over and over. It was seamless, perfect. It's solid, he said, his voice flat with disappointment. No, Clementine insisted, coming to his side. Look, at the base. There's a line, in the grain. It's almost invisible. She traced it with her fingernail. A tiny hairline crack. Cade stared at it. Then with a trembling hand he twisted the base. It moved. With a soft click, the bottom of the carving came away in his hand. It was a small, round plug of wood. Inside, the wren was hollowed out, and tucked into the cavity was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of oilcloth. Cade's breath hitched. With fingers that shook, he pulled it out and unrolled it on the table. It was not the ledgers. It was a single sheet of paper. A letter, written in a neat, elegant hand. Liam's hand. Cade read it aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Brother, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. Reed is more dangerous than I knew. I have hidden the ledgers, but not where he would look. He thinks in terms of earth and iron, safes and cellars. He does not think like a Calloway. Remember the summer we spent mending the old spring house. Remember what Father taught us about a dry stone wall? The heart of the wall is the stone that holds the key. Go there. The truth will set us free. Your brother, Liam. The spring house. Cade looked up at Clementine, his eyes wild with a hope so fierce it was painful. I know the place, he breathed. It's 1/2 mile from here. The wall collapsed years ago. I never thought. A shout from outside shattered the moment. Hello? Anyone in this cabin? It was Barlow's voice. They had been found. Cade's first instinct was to bolt the door. The old fear, the habit of hiding, was strong. But Clementine put her hand on his arm. No more hiding, Cade, she said, her voice firm and clear. Not anymore. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face. He looked at his brother's letter in his hand. And something inside him, something that had been frozen for 10 years, broke free. He straightened up, his shoulders squaring. The ghost was gone. Cade Calloway was standing in his own home. He walked to the door and threw it open. Jonas Barlow and the other man stood there, their faces lit by the lantern they carried. Barlow's jaw dropped when he saw Clementine standing behind Cade, alive and whole. You, Barlow sputtered. We thought you were dead. No thanks to you, Clementine said, her voice cold as ice. Barlow's gaze shifted to Cade, taking in his size and the hard look on his face. Who's this? What is this place? This is my home, Cade said, his voice a low rumble. And you're trespassing. The second man, whose eyes were small and mean, stepped forward. We ain't trespassing. We got a right. Mr. Reed in Harmony sent us. Said this patch of land was available. Said we might find something the last owner left behind. The last owner is right here, Cade said. And you're not finding anything. Barlow's greed overcame his fear. Don't listen to him. He's just some squatter. Reed said this was Calloway land. Said they ran out years ago. Probably left a stash. We're here to claim it. Suddenly the pieces clicked into place for Clementine. "You didn't come back for me," she said to Barlow. "You went to Harmony, and you met with Reed. You told him you left a woman for dead on Callaway land, and he got scared. He got scared I might have found this cabin, that I might have found Cade. He sent you back here to silence us both and find whatever it is he's been afraid of all these years." Barlow's face went pale. He knew she was right. "Get off my land," Cade said, his voice dropping dangerously. The second man laughed, a short, ugly sound. He pulled a pistol from his belt. "We ain't going nowhere. Now you're going to tell us where the Callaway money is." Cade didn't flinch. He just took a slow step forward. "There is no money," he said. "There's just the truth, and you don't want to find that." He was magnificent. Standing there, unarmed, facing down a gun to protect his home, to protect her. He was no longer a man broken by the past. He was the man his brother believed him to be. The man raised the pistol. "Last chance, squatter." Before he could fire, before Cade could move, Clementine acted. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. With a cry, she swung it with all her might, not at the man, but at the lantern he held. There was a crash of glass, a splash of oil, and the front of the man's coat erupted in flames. He screamed, dropping the pistol and beating at his chest. Barlow stared, frozen in horror. In that moment of chaos, Cade lunged. He hit the gunman with his full weight, sending him crashing to the ground. The pistol skittered across the floorboards. Cade subdued the flailing man, rolling him in the dirt to smother the flames. Barlow turned to run. Clementine was faster. She scooped up the fallen pistol and leveled it at him. "Stay right where you are, Mr. Barlow." He froze, his hands raised, his face a mask of terror. It was over. They tied them up with rope from the corral. Cade found the ledgers in the spring house the next morning, tucked inside a hollowed-out stone exactly as Liam's letter had promised. They were damning. A meticulous record of Reed's decade-long theft, all in his own handwriting. They left the valley 2 days later not as fugitives, but as dispensers of justice. They marched Barlow and his hired thug into Harmony at the end of a rope. The town stared as they walked down the main street. A ghost returned from the dead and the woman no one had ever seen. They went straight to the land office. Mr. Reed was there. A portly, smiling man with a gold watch chain and cold, calculating eyes. When he saw Cade walk through the door, all the color drained from his face. "Callaway," he breathed, his voice a strangled whisper. "Reed," Cade said, his voice calm and steady. He threw the ledgers down on the counter. "I believe these are yours." The town sheriff was called. The matriarch of the town, Mrs. Gable, who had always championed Reed as a pillar of the community, arrived to see what the commotion was about. In front of them all, Cade told his story. He told them about the lies, the theft, his brother's murder. Clementine stood beside him, her presence a silent confirmation of every word. When he was done, he opened the ledgers. The proof was undeniable. Reed sputtered and denied, but his guilt was written all over his face. Barlow, seeing his own fate sealed, began to confess everything, telling the sheriff how Reed had sent him back to the cabin to take care of the squatter. The truth had been set free. Reed was arrested. The Barlows were jailed for their abandonment of Clementine and their part in the conspiracy. The Callaway name was cleared, and in the middle of the crowded office, with the entire town watching, Cade turned to Clementine. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his pale gray eyes full of a decade of gratitude, a lifetime of love. He had been a ghost, a man left for dead by grief and injustice. And she, a woman left for dead by cruelty, had followed a thread of smoke and led him back into the light. She had saved him, and he had saved her. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and sure. "Let's go home," he said. Spring came to the high valley, painting the meadows in wildflowers. The cabin door stood open, letting in the warm, fragrant air. The map in the Harmony Land Office had been redrawn. The valley, once a blank space, now bore a single proud name, Callaway. Kate had added a room to the cabin and a porch where they sat in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the peaks. The wooden wren sat on the mantelpiece, its head cocked, listening to the sounds of a home no longer silent. They had been left for dead in their own ways, lost in the high country of their own sorrows. But they had followed the smoke, and it had led them not just to a cabin, but to each other. They had found a life in the place the world called empty. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you followed the smoke, what truth would you find waiting for you? We hope this story of courage and homecoming warmed your heart. If it did, please show your support with a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the Old West. And let us know in the comments below, would you have walked toward that cabin?